In this podcast, I'd like to do something a little different. I'd like to reiterate my long-standing commitment to Israel and to the Jewish people, and to what I've always referred to as the superior nature of Jewish civilization. So let's explore this issue a bit more. You're listening to the Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. And if you're a fan of the Jason Hill Show, please contribute via the link in the description below. Against the backdrop of increasing invectives against the Jewish people and their civilization by Holocaust deniers and most recently by the rapper Kanye West, one is led to ponder a question which will be the entire subject, let's say, of a separate podcast. And the question is, why historically have Jews been the most persecuted people on the face of the earth since their inception? What is it about these resilient and remarkable people and their civilization, one that has spawned several millennia, that has incurred the wrath and envy of so many people, wherever they have established roots? Let's all think about this phenomenon for a while. I'll come back to it and speak to the matter in a much deeper manner. But for now, let's backtrack a bit. In 2019, against the backdrop of what I saw as rising anti-Semitism, or more precisely anti-Jewry, rising Jew hatred and resentment of the exalted nature of Jewish civilization, I decided to do something about it, because I was growing sick and tired of learning or hearing that Israel was regarded as one of the most ethical states on the planet, was genocidal. And it was a genocidal apartheid state, that it was bigoted, and it was racist and guilty of inflicting a series of unprovoked attacks against Palestinians. I had grown disgusted at seeing the proliferation of BDS movements, that is, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, that target Israeli organizations, academic institutions, and companies engaged in entrepreneurial activities in Israel to weaken the Israeli economy and to politically force Israel to change its policies towards Palestinians living there. Now, we must remember that BDS movements, mainly conducted by their visible branch, Students for Justice in Palestine, otherwise known as SJP, are quite prolific on U.S. campuses, and they enact a reign of verbal terror and physical and psychological violence against anyone who dares to be pro-Israel, who are critical of Palestinian terrorists, or defend Israel against false charges of it being a genocidal and apartheid state. Now, really, it places serious assaults against Western civilization and the United States interests, and should properly be considered, I think, in this country, a national security threat. Now, as a recent victim of vicious assaults by members of the Students for Justice in Palestine at DePaul University, where I am a full tenured professor and with the highest praises and respect from the provost for the ways in which members of the DePaul community made their voices heard, I actually call for a disbandment of all SJP campus units by the U.S. Justice Department, and a thorough investigation into the motives and political involvements of higher level academic bodies that endorse these organizations, which have ties with terrorist organizations such as the American Muslims for Palestine, which is funded by Hamas. BDS movements are largely immoral, I think, because they use slander, libel, and defamation of Israel, and by association the United States, to bring Israel to the brink of economic, and political disaster. Their real immorality, however, I think lies in their guiding ethos, which is hatred of Jews for simply being Jews, and hatred of the West, including the United States of America, for our values. Now, operating under the guise of a movement directed at what they claim are egregious policies of Israel, the movement, the BDS movement, is an insidious body of nefarious characters funded by organizations linked to terrorist networks. As I said, the AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine, which is funded by the AMP, to terrorist networks and large-scale organizations. And their real hatred lies not in policies, but in the achievements of the Jewish state. Its success in transforming what was an arid and barren desert into a thriving democratic civilization. That's what Israel did. They hate it because it is the only country in the Middle East that practices religious reciprocity and is a haven for gay people fleeing sexual persecution in most parts, if not all parts, of the Middle East. It's the only country that actually hosts a pro-gay pride parade in the Middle East. And it's the only country in the Middle East where gays can properly seek sexual asylum for sexual oppression. They hate the fact that Israel is the only country in the Middle East where thousands of people seek asylum from the oppressive and illiberal practices of Islamic Sharia law in neighboring Arab countries. The most virulent and visible arm of the BDS movement is an organization widespread across more than 200 campuses in the United States of America called Students for Justice in Palestine. And it was created in 2001 by Hamas supporter Hatem Bazian. And it acts under the auspices of the International Socialist Organization, which is designed to wage a campus war against Israel and the United States. Now, many people forget that Hamas is a US recognized terrorist and dictatorial regime that is militantly anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, that subjects women to honor killings and defends a place where homosexuals are tortured and beaten to death, and along with peaceful dissenters, journalists and protesters are dragged through the streets and executed. So I decided in 2019 that it was time to put my moral convictions to paper. It was a decision that would result in a very major upheaval in my life, causing me to be the only university professor in my life, in my university, I should say, to be formally censured, to receive death threats, to be labeled a war criminal, a genocidal criminal, an advocate of ethnic cleansing, an Arab hater, among other things, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast. So what did I do? Well, I wrote an article defending Israel's right to annex Judea and Samaria, what is commonly called the West Bank, and beyond. I wrote an article called The Moral Case for Israel Annexing the West Bank and Beyond. And this article was written in 2019, published in The Federalist. I wrote that the April 2000 election victory for Benjamin Netanyahu will see him serve a record fifth term as Israeli Prime Minister and form a new right-wing coalition government. It also brings the promise of a commitment Netanyahu made to the nation during his campaign, that he would annex Jewish settlements in occupied Palestinian territories, so-called occupied Palestinian territories. Voting to extend sovereignty without distinguishing between settlement blocks and the isolated settlements Netanyahu promised not to transfer any sovereignty to the Palestinians. His victory in the elections will hopefully see the enactment of Netanyahu's promise. Israel has the moral right to annex all of the West Bank, even Area C, for a plethora of reasons. Israel's mistake was allowing the Palestinians pretense. Israel made an altruistic mistake towards the Palestinian people after the 1967 defensive war with Jordan. Now, rather than make them or regard them as war settlers or refugee, or after legally occupying conquered territory as illegal occupants, they made the Palestinian people their political and moral problem. After victory, the war settlers could have been seen as enemies of the state, supporters of the Fatah, Palestinian Liberal Organization, charter, which basically calls for the end of Jewry in the region. Now, under a malevolent and illiberal regime, they would have been regarded and treated as such, not as Israel did treat them, which was as human beings with specific inalienable rights. Under a different set of political sensibilities, the Palestinian people would have been militarily removed from the area. Morally speaking, after the 1967 war, they never belonged there. The proper response from Israel should have been to immediately annex the land and make the people there the responsibility of the original political homeland, of their original political homeland, Jordan. No, there can be no such thing as legitimate Palestinian territory in a geographic region legally seized in a defensive war instigated by a foreign aggressor. The purpose of war is always to vanquish the enemy. The losers of the war cannot make demands on the victors that the victors themselves would not have been put in the position of meeting had the adversary or enemy not forced the victors into making it in the first place. Israel was forced into a war which it won. It was then expected to renounce and repudiate the consequences of its fairly won war by capitulating to the conditions of its vanquished enemy, which included, among other self-sacrificially undertaken goals, granting statehood, autonomy, right of return, and the ultimate elimination of Jewry from the region. The Palestinian Authority is a terrible government. Since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994, Judea and Samaria, what's called the West Bank, have enjoyed joint rule by Israeli military government and the Palestinian Authority, with around 98% of the Palestinians living in areas under jurisdiction of the PA. In such areas, the Palestinian Authority has destroyed the freedom Palestinians enjoyed under Israeli rule and their economy through kleptocracy, corruption, nepotism, and authoritarian forms of government subject to none of the checks and balances that characterize Israel's Knesset. Now, Jewish exceptionalism and the exceptionist nature of Jewish civilization require an unconditional space for the continued evolution of their civilization. I think what's good for Jewish civilization is good for humanity at large. Jewish civilization is an international treasure trove that must be protected. Not all cultures are indeed equal. Some are abysmally inferior and regressive based on their comprehensive philosophy and fundamental principles or lack thereof that guide or fail to protect the inalienable rights of their citizens. Now, given the voting patterns of Palestinians towards Islamicism and terrorist organizations, for the most part, that openly advocate and work for Israeli and Jewish destruction, and annihilation, a strong argument can and ought to be made to strip Palestinians of their right to vote, period. The regional hostilities towards Israel in the Middle East are such that Israel must take those threats very seriously. It must work for a coalition of forces to neutralize them, and Israel has every right to defeat terrorists. The Israeli left should abandon its agonistic hand-wringing over so-called Palestinian occupation and realize that applying Israeli law in Judea and Samaria, meaning the wholesale destruction of Hamas in Gaza, Hamas being a terrorist organization that can claim no rights as a group and no right to any square inch of land in the region, is an application of democratic law protecting the rights of the individuals who rightfully belong there. Now, speaking of Gaza, although the Strip was unilaterally relinquished, when one considers the reign of terror executed by the Hamas terrorists and the unadulterated illiberality of the movement itself, Israel has every moral right to wage a ruthless and unrelenting war against Hamas and to resettle the land if it ever so desires. Now, America must also admit that it owes Israel political and financial reparations for America's many decades of support of the PLO and the PA, which have pledged destruction to Israel and have rejected all plausible peace offerings from Israel, preferring instead war and destruction. The political and economic reparation would see the United States supplying Israel even more advanced military capabilities and funding Israel's military defense in any manner Israel deems necessary for its survival and unrivaled military status in the Middle East. Some may ask, why is this necessary? Well, I think the answer is twofold. Should a regional conflict between Israel and her Arab neighbors emerge, Israel will need to demonstrate extraordinary, excessive, and unprecedented military might in a manner that can act as a deterrent and, if necessary, to irrevocably destroy her offensive enemies. Additional U.S. militarization of Israel is also moral in its execution. It sends a univocally clear message to the world that in any conflict between Israel and her adversaries, the United States stands willing and ready, along with her ally, to destroy any political agent that attacks the sovereignty of Israel. This is because Israel's right to exist is non-negotiable, and it has a right to unilaterally apply Israeli law over its nation state. Now, here's why the Palestinians have no moral authority. Continued militarization of Israel comprises protracted support of our political and moral alter ego in the Middle East. Israel is our moral and political alter ego in the Middle East. The decline of the Palestinian people is narrated by their willful ideological malfeasance. They have never come into their own as a people, largely because they have never explicitly held a philosophy that can support freedom, the basic liberal principles of individual rights, and a free market. Given Fatah and Hamas's genocidal aspirations towards Israel and universal Jewry, and in the case of Hamas, a global caliphate, a moral goal would be to reverse the potential sovereignty of every Palestinian movement in the region. And it ought to force Jordan to revoke its citizenship status of the Palestinian majority in Jordan. A people that overwhelmingly approves of their terrorist leaders, cannot be made to become citizens of any civilized country, such as Israel. The Palestinian terror war Fatah launched after the 2000 Camp David peace summit and unilaterally accepted by the Palestinian people places them in a precarious position. Whatever action Israel or any of her allies take against them in a war against terror are their responsibility and are moral. A people that overwhelmingly approves of their terrorist leaders cannot be made to become citizens of any civilized country such as Israel. No moral or political distinction must be made between Fatah, Hamas, and the people who elect and or support them. No constituted people responsible for the election and appointment of terrorist actors can or should be entrusted with the responsibility of voting. They constitute a national security threat to Israel because a core feature of their identity is a commitment to destroying Israel as a Jewish state. Therefore, only a policy of radical containment or expulsion remains a viable option. No state can obstruct the case for the achievement of its own justice and territorial safety by aiding and abetting its own destroyers. By making strategic alliances with ISIS, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations, should political expediency dictate such a move, we will witness the destruction of Jewish secularism in the region and religious militarization of the entire region itself. Now, one cannot admit anti-Semitics devoted to the destruction of Israel into the domain of Jewish civilization. It cannot happen. There has to be some semblance of reshaping the political sensibilities of those outside the historic process. If this is not possible, then we have to admit to their intrinsic humanity, but also nevertheless confess to their tragic status as political ballasts. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue with why I think moral citizens of the world have to dispense with the idea of calling Jewish settlers, among other things. You're listening to The Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. Back in a moment. This is the Jason Hill Show, and you're listening to a podcast on why I think we have a moral responsibility against the backdrop of recent and continued anti-Semitism, anti-Jewry, and anti-Jewish civilization to defend not just the Jewish state and not to defend just Jewish civilization, but to call out those who are expressing anti-Semitic invectives in today's world. I want to address in this section why I think that there are no such thing as settlers. But before I do that, I'm often asked today, after having had my classes boycotted, after having had so many student organizations take over a building in my university, scattering and disseminating thousands of leaflets with photos of me with horns protruding from my head, chanting, "Professor Hill, you can't hide. We know you want genocide, and ho, racist prophets got to go." If I'd still defend Israel, if I'd still defend what I call the superiority of the Jewish civilization, if after needing security protection for up to a month after the publication of my articles, if after suffering the loss of all my friends, and I mean all my friends at DePaul University, if I'd write the same article again. And I say resoundingly, yes. And I say yes because I think that Israel is a morally good country. When I was requested to submit myself to racial sensitivity workshops, I refused. I had gone through in 2016 a year-long conversion program to convert to Judaism. And I changed my mind, I think, 2 days before my conversion for very, very personal reasons, which I'll talk about in a subsequent podcast. But I knew the history of Jewish civilization, and I knew the history of Israel. I'd been studying it as a child, largely because my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, was raised by a Sephardic Jewish father. She was raised by a Sephardic Jewish father in Jamaica, where I'm from. And I knew the history of Israel. So when I was told by administrators at my university to refrain from writing further controversial articles, I thought of all the persecutions of the Jewish people that they had suffered and faced, including those of my grandmother's ancestors. And I was possessed of a burning desire to defend those who had been called settlers. Those who had been called settlers and occupiers in the West Bank. And these alleged civilian settlers were accused of violating international law. But I thought differently. I thought that moral citizens of the world must begin a radical reversal of certain anti-Israeli and anti-Jewry references to the so-called settlers of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank it's called, and what had been mistakenly referred to as occupied territory. To begin with, Israeli Jews are not settlers in Judea and Samaria. So from here on, they should be referred to as heroic pioneers on holy, refounded Israeli land. This is the land of Moses, a nation unified under King David, the only nation blessed by God in the Bible, renamed Palestine by the Romans in the 2nd century, and later artificially divided into 3 states. This is the land occupied and destroyed, and its people exiled and conquered immorally under the Egyptians in 1523 BCE to 1313 BCE, Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar in 423 BCE to 372 BCE, Persia Media 372 BCE to 140 BCE, Greece in 371 BCE to 140 BCE, and Rome from 69 in the Common Era to the present. Under the Roman Empire, we witnessed the apocalyptic and most devastating blow to Jewish sovereignty that lasted for 2,000 years. It allowed for, among other dastardly intrusions, occupation under the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire. So let us not forget a few historical minutiae. With the legal refounding, or we could say rediscovery, of the State of Israel in 1948, the local Palestinian militia groups, along with Egypt, Jordan, then called Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, fought a vicious war, along with contingent forces from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, to annihilate tiny Israel. Now, Jordan confiscated Judea and Samaria, which it illegally annexed in 1950. In a 1967 six-day defensive war against Jordan, Israel retook its holy lands of Judea and Samaria from Jordan. And let us remember that Judea and Samaria historically belonged to holy Israel and the Jewish people. It never belonged to a Palestinian state, nor to a political entity known as the Palestinians. Let us remember, too, that Palestinians are really Jordanians. There are no such people as the Palestinian people. Before 1964, the reference of such a term were the Jewish people. In any case, the post-1964 self-described Palestinians only began claiming the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, following the Israeli defensive war against Jordan in 1967. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was formed in 1964 in order to establish a Palestinian state inside the State of Israel. There was no mention of the West Bank, which had been illegally annexed by Jordan as part of a Palestinian state before 1967. So the world must now say to the people who refer to themselves as Palestinians, your people waged a ruthless war against Israel. You lost the war, and rather than be grateful that Israel did not fight a war of attrition, as the United States did in Dresden, Germany, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima in Japan, and annihilated you completely, you have the temerity to proclaim you have a right to reclaim you won land, to rightfully reclaim one land. So I think we have to strike really from our vocabulary the term occupied territory. The Jordanian annexation of Judea and Samaria was regarded as illegal. The British had relinquished its claim to the land when the British mandate left the region. The Arab forces claimed vehemently that the 1949 armistice line did not have any legal significance. By that reasoning, the land did not belong to anyone. Since the land did not belong to Transjordan, we must not use the term occupied territory. And under the precepts of international law, it is nonsensical nomenclature. If disputed land makes better sense, then that conceptually inane term was laid to rest when Israel legally won a war and conquered territory that was taken from it. And we must remember too that both Hamas and first the PLO and the Palestinian National Authority have made a permanent declaration of war against Israel. Their charters both call for the obliteration of the State of Israel and the removal of Jewry from the area, along with the indoctrination school curriculum promulgating hatred and debasement against Jews and Israel by both the PA and the Hamas. The charters indict both parties in a state of war against Israel. Now, the Second Intifada, orchestrated by then PLO leader Yasser Arafat, completely, as far as I'm concerned, neutralized the Oslo Accords. This means that any action Israel takes against the PA and those who voted into power, such as refusal to confer citizenship and voting privileges to a population that vote terrorist organizations into power, are moral responses to a declaration of permanent war by sworn enemies of the state. There can be no peace once those charters exist. And we must remember that before the 1948 refounding of Israel, the region called Judea and Samaria, in fact, the land today referred today as the State of Israel, even under the British mandate, was a primordial and primitive backwater buildings, with a few buildings, a few planted trees and grazing sheep with a plethora of shepherds. But it lay outside the historic process, outside the process of history. It was not progressing towards any growth and technological prosperity. Its trajectory was an inverted one. The pastoral and bucolic lives of shepherds make for nice short stories and sentimental poetry. An emulative and monumental civilization they do not constitute. If they are occupiers in Judea and Samaria, then we may ostensibly point to them as the war settlers who are Jordanian Palestinians. They are the real occupiers and improper settlers of the land. And so we must say to Israelis, you may or you must actually expunge from your identity the term settlers and see yourselves as noble pioneers fulfilling your lost manifest destiny. In the name of the best within you, do not sully and tarnish it by the prejudicial ways an envious and anti-Jewry world regards you and wants you to regard yourself. Do not bind to their terminology. The only way the moral legitimacy of the refounding of your holy lands can be intransigently enforced and asserted to the world is if on moral grounds you persuade your government to totally annex all of Judea and Samaria. Desist in referring to it as the West Bank, and most importantly, declare proudly to the world that as noble pioneers, your moral identities are non-negotiable. Announce defiantly that you have the moral right to determine who lives within the borders of your annexed territories. Treat your moral identity with the same implacability as you would a religious commandment. Let it be known that such an identity is a force of nature that behaves with the same inexorability and invariability as the laws of nature. Proclaim proudly that you are noble pioneers and refounders of the lost treasure troves of Holy Israel. And if you can do this consistently and without compromise to your sworn enemies, then the glory is yours. Well, we're going to take our final break, and when we come back, I'm going to read a letter that I wrote to Prime Minister Netanyahu celebrating his victory as Prime Minister of Israel. We'll be back. You're listening to The Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. This is Jason Hill. You're listening to The Jason Hill Show. If you're a fan of The Jason Hill Show, please contribute via the link in the description. When Prime Minister Netanyahu won his victory in 2019, I wrote him a letter. The letter stands, which was widely read in all of Israel, and the letter stands as a testimony to his victory in 2019. It also stands as a testimony to his recent victory as Prime Minister again in 2022. I have sort of updated the letter, and I wanted to share my homage to Prime Minister Netanyahu in this final segment of the Jason Hill Show. I'm a great admirer of that man. I think he will lead Israel into greatness, and I think by the nature of this letter that I have written to him, that you will see how much I respect him as a leader and a stalwart figure in Israel. Dear Prime Minister Netanyahu, I write to you as an admirer, as a moral philosopher, and as an immigrant from America, from Jamaica, where part of my ancestral bloodline can be traced to a maternal great-grandfather who was a Sephardic Jew and whose people came to Jamaica from Jerusalem via Portugal. Your name, as you know, means given by God. And so you have been offered up to your people in historic supreme leadership in your unprecedented role in serving as fifth-term Prime Minister of Israel. You hail from the line of the first three great patriarchs of Israel, and like the first Abraham, you have been singled out by God to lead your great state and exceptional civilization. Unlike Abraham, you do not have to flee your own homeland. You only have to defend it ruthlessly and intransigently and with moral implacability, protected by any means necessary against those who have sworn your people as their eternal enemies and who have codified in their charters a jihadist roadmap to the destruction of your country and your people. Like Abraham's people, many of God's chosen people have yet to accommodate themselves to you and your prophetic role as an historic figure. You, the patriarch of Israel, are a mouthpiece of the dead and a living producer of victories yet to come. Jews have had a 3,300-year presence in the land of Israel. In your heroic years ahead, and in your historic fifth term as Prime Minister of Israel, the task of preserving that homeland lies in the unyielding grip of your hands. As much of Europe grows anti-Semitic, more anti-Semitic, with each passing year, and as that most racist of institutions, the United Nations, along with Europe and parts of America, seem to stamp their moral approval upon the terrorist organizations of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, you face a lonely and daunting task in decisions you will make in the self-defense of your country. You will undoubtedly act unilaterally and defiantly at times and toss international approval where it belongs, in the dustbin where stale, musky, racist detritus resides, and where the moral grammar of rights are not really up for grabs. They have been allocated to your sworn enemies, while your state is deemed worthy of none. Indeed, when the United Nations tries to shame your country for defending itself against war crimes committed by Hamas, by declaring that you ought to share your iron defense technology with the very group trying to kill your citizens, then there is no lower egregiously shameful space of moral degradation that the United Nations can occupy. Let the world remember that Hamas has repeatedly shot more than 9,000 missiles and mortar rockets into Israel from Gaza since your state withdrew military forces from there in 2005. What the world is witnessing, Prime Minister, when it watches the Palestinian war against Israel is a clash of manifest destinies. Those manifest destinies are irreconcilable. What few fail to realize is that the manifest destinies of both societies are morally and a fortiori logically irreconcilable. The manifest destinies of the invented Palestinian people is an iteration of the larger Arab and Iranian worldview. It is an expansionist, annihilatory, predatory, and it has as a constitutive feature of its political identity a belief that Jews in the region are a non-negotiable foreign entity that one way or another must be obliterated. Written into its political DNA is a hatred of the Jew as Jew, and a view of Israel as an artificial and illegitimate creation that must be dissolved as a necessary consideration for the total and uncompromising freedom of the Palestinian people. That is their final solution. The establishment of a global Islamic caliphate and the concomitant animus towards Jews that is its logical derivative is the constitutive feature of pan-Arab national, moral, and political identity. Peace is impossible because proximity to Jews and the mere existence of Israel are non-negotiable facts that the Palestinians cannot abide by. The hard truth is that the peace offerers, Israeli political actors, have failed to recognize that in the minds of Palestinian leaders and their supporters, their emancipation is inexorably linked to Jewish annihilation in the Middle East, and for some of the more radical extremists in the world. This is a fundamentally nihilistic and misanthropic identity and ideology that they hold, because they are ones that require the destruction of a democratic and civilized state and its people in order for another group of people to exist. The manifest destiny of Israel is to claim its historical homeland, to continue to build a thriving civilization in what was once an uncultivated desert with deterrent swamps, and to cultivate a region that before her arrival existed largely outside the historical process, a disparate unit of tribes with no participation in the making of a universal history. Prime Minister, Israel's manifest destiny is one rooted in a philosophy of self-containment that is linked to the can-do entrepreneurial, creative, and innovative spirit of her people. Israel's manifest destiny is an aspirational one that speaks to the Jewish people, not just finding a permanent home for themselves after millennia of exilic and diasporic existence in the world. It is also an aspirational quest, buttressed by a promise delivered by God to give his people a return to their home. In that milieu, Jewish moral agency comes closer to manifesting their vocational call to repair the world as their chosen first people of God. They, more than any other religious civilization, have literally known the mind of God himself. Access to God's mind and will are best discovered in a political state whose people were the first in monotheistic history to share an intimate and personal relationship to God, and who were the first divine repositories and transmitters of God's laws. Israel's manifest destiny is one that is forged through a holy covenant and signed with the moral insignia of God himself. Jews were the first civilized people to enter into direct conversation with God, to receive law from him, and to begin the construction of what today we call Western civilization. Prime Minister, you are besieged with endless calls for peace talks and initiatives. All of these talks center around what we all know can never be a reality, a two-state solution. Any further talk about peace with the Palestinian Authority and any of its administrative bodies, and even peace brokering with Hamas, are deeply unethical. Peace engagements are unethical for several reasons. First, having accepted that Palestinian emancipation in the minds of the PA and their supporters rests on Jewish annihilation, Israel can only act in an irrationally altruistic fashion to pretend that peace is possible. This means engaging in willful self-deception in order to placate one's enemies at the cost of the flourishing of one's own people. This includes, and has included, land swapping for peace, failure to annex the West Bank, handing over Gaza to the Palestinians, and failing to apply Israeli law unilaterally across the State of Israel. It is unethical because it treats war settlers and occupants on Israeli territory as if they are legitimate custodians of the land they claim belongs to them. They are not such custodians. They are properly wards of the state of Jordan, who instigated a war and lost a war against Israel. In that war, Israel, rather than vanquish the enemy, which is the only proper moral end of war, failed to annex the land that was legally captured, and in return granted political recognition to illegal settlers on conquered territory. This recognition of war settlers as legitimate political sovereigns required Israel to place her own rational self-interest below the demands made by illegal aliens now on foreign territory. Israel thus compromised her political self-esteem through decades of appeasement, placation, and at times renunciation of her fundamental values as a Jewish state to an avowed enemy. It is bad to have enemies. It is tragic and immoral to aid and abet one's own destroyers. To repeatedly engage in such endeavors is to publicly renounce the intrinsic values of one's life and the state one lives in, which is a precondition for one's existence, by, among other things, caring about international respectability and moral prestige at the expense of the national security of one's country. Prime Minister, I hope that Israel will be unfazed by the international anti-Semitism that it faces daily, as accusations of it as a genocidal and apartheid state become common canards among political leaders around the world. Some countries still fail to recognize Israel as a legitimate state, while the United Nations legitimizes the PLO-PA terrorist organization and the Nobel Academy awarded a Nobel Peace Prize to the terrorist mastermind behind the PLO, the late Yasser Arafat. Arafat never once abjured terror against Israel. Even European Union members, Portugal, Denmark, Ireland, and Finland, attempted to block the European Union from condemning Hamas's leaders' call for the destruction of Israel. Until Israel accepts that worldwide political anti-Semitism is still pervasive in Europe and around much of the world, she will be constant appeasers and will seek to placate her destroyers. The crisis within the Palestinian leadership has not only to do with the corrupt machinations of its actors. That corruption is a logical corollary of the intransigent fanaticism within the Palestinian national movement itself, and its willful intention to define by formal decree, through its charters and covenants, the destruction of Israel. Prime Minister, you and your allies may have to force Jordan to revoke its Palestinian majority citizenship laws in Jordan and relocate at least those Palestinians in the West Bank to Jordan. It may involve a ruthless application of increased militarization of regions occupied by Palestinians. However you choose to secure the sustained national interest of Israel, it is not your moral responsibility to burden yourself with the political existential well-being of the Palestinian people. Stripping the Palestinians of the right to vote as a national security measure may be a good operational strategy. People who vote terrorist institutions to represent them and whose said institutions target Israel for destruction cannot be viewed as politically mature, civic-minded individuals. Their goals and the sustainability of Israel are irreconcilable. When leadership backed by terrorist agendas based on one's annihilation are the order of the day, one need not consult the enemy on means by which one ought best to protect oneself. However, you and your government which you will choose, from which you sail to victory, however you choose to vanquish the enemy within your nation, remains your moral prerogative. And in a situation where one's enemies regard your obligation, or your obliteration, I should say, as non-negotiable, whatever means you choose to vanquish the enemy will be both expedient and morally permissible. I have already written in the subsequent article that Israel has a moral right to annex all of Judea and Samaria. Your heroic and ethical state fought a defensive 6-day war against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. You won that war, and in the process, reconquered the holy lands of Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem. Rather than annex the area now called the West Bank immediately after the 6-day war, Israel fought an altruistic war and made the war settlers their moral responsibility, instead of relocating them to the country which launched the war, Jordan. Similarly, Israel has every right to apply Israeli law and exercise total sovereignty over the Golan Heights. As a matter of moral fact, you have the moral right to apply Israeli law over every square inch of Israel. Your country is small, it cannot shrink. From a moral standpoint, permit our readers to be reminded of the two other instances in which Israeli leadership, acting in good faith and benevolence and a true desire to repair the world, sought to broker a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. The 2000 Camp David summit, organized by President Clinton between then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, saw an unprecedented offer made by the Israelis to the Palestinians. They included shared sovereignty over Israel, which no Israeli leader had ever considered doing. Barak offered them all of Gaza, 92% of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and control over the Jordan Valley. Barak refused to concede to the demands of the so-called right to return, which we know with absolute certainty would have led to the destruction of Israel. The Palestinians rejected peace and statehood and began massive terrorist attacks against Israel and began the Second Intifada. Again, in 2008, then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert made PLO chairman and Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas an even more generous offer of peace and Palestinian statehood. Olmert, acting in good faith on the belief that peace and Palestinian conflict would cease, made the following offer to Abbas: 94% of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, an additional 327 square kilometers of land with sovereign Israel adjacent to the Gaza Strip and northern Samaria. Additionally, he offered Palestinian sovereignty over Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem. He offered, too, to transfer the sovereignty of the Temple Mount and sacred areas of Jerusalem's old city to an international body. And perhaps the most radical act of generosity made by a state attacked by foreign countries during the 1948 Arab-Israeli war against Israel, he offered a limited right of immigration to descendants of Arabs who left Israel in 1948 to 1949. How did Abbas respond? He waged an anti-Israeli publicity campaign war on behalf of the PLO on the international level and in the United Nations. It was cited as a diplomatic response to an unacceptable offer. It was a vicious and mean-spirited attack on Israel's moral integrity. It is clear that the goals of the governing Palestinian bodies are to establish a Palestinian state that, as journalist Caroline Glick describes, exists in a de facto state of war with Israel. Prime Minister, it is putatively obvious that the Oslo Accords were nullified and neutralized by the Second Intifada, engineered by the PA and its terrorist leader Yasser Arafat. Israel is under no moral obligations to abide by that treaty any longer. The Oslo I Accord asked that each party accept the other as a negotiating partner, that the PLO recognize the State of Israel, and that Israel recognize the PLO as a representative of the Palestinians. Although it was indeed a moral concession on the part of Israel to recognize a terrorist organization as a legitimate governing body, it complied in good faith, not the PLO. Israel has every right to not only annex every part of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. I believe Israel should also retake Bethlehem from Palestinian administrative control. What has the Palestinian leadership done to Bethlehem? What? It has decimated the Christian population. Christians made up 85% of Bethlehem's population in 1949 when Jordan took control of the city, and 60% in 1990. By 2009, they constituted just 12% of the population. Bethlehem has no business being under Palestinian administrative control. No part of Israel should ever be ceded to political leadership that is politically regressive, has no concept of civil liberties, human rights, or respect for the sacred inviolability of human life. The Palestinian pay-for-slave program under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority law mandates salaries for terrorists to kill American and Israeli civilians. Palestinian officials describe the terror trust recipients as soldiers and sons of our nations. If ever there was a good reason to annihilate the PA and evict its supporters and all who endorse the programs from the State of Israel, this would be it. The nullification and neutralization of the reign of terror that was the Second Intifada has stripped the PA and its governing bodies of any moral credibility and claims to any right. They suspend recognition of Israel and today, still, by their very charter, live by an anti-Zionist credo that is dedicated to a Palestinian homeland. What I fervently hope you will accomplish, Prime Minister, is the complete demilitarization of the Palestinian Authority, to strip it of any governing rights over any part of Judea and Samaria, and ultimately to destroy it completely as an internal foreign aggressor dedicated by constitutional design to obliterate your state and your people. They have no right of jurisdiction over Bethlehem, and they have no right to govern anywhere in the state of Israel. They have no such right any more than an intruder plotting your destruction would have a right to your house, let alone have the right or the moral temerity to exercise autonomy, jurisdiction over any part of your domicile. And Gaza. How has Hamas, Iran's proxy and surrogate in the nation, and the Palestinian segment of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the region, along with its citizens who voted its leadership into power, repaid Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the region? I have already pointed out the reign of terror they continue to unleash by targeting civilian populations in Israel. Hamas is at war with Israel, and I believe that the moral goal of war is to completely vanquish the enemy. Your country has been fighting an altruistic war with Hamas for a long time, and for some, it seems as if Israel cares more about Palestinian civilians than it does for her children, women, and men. I say no more. The next time Hamas decides to fire 450 mortar rockets and launch flaming kites and helium balloons into Israel from Gaza that destroy the farming lands of innocent Israelis and suffocate thousands of animals to death, remember that they amount to war crimes. Let the citizens of Israel meditate. Let them meditate on how the United States morally defeated Germany and Japan in World War II. Think about Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. When the dust has fallen, remember that Egypt is contiguous with Gaza, and that Hamas has always valued its ties to Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood there. Relocate the population to Egypt and resettle Gaza, where the ambitious and enterprising Israeli citizens will turn that now barren wasteland into a flourishing agricultural mecca and reintroduce entrepreneurial vitality. Those rockets and incendiary kites and helium balloons have created an ecological disaster that will take perhaps decades for your country to recover. Hamas has never cared about creating a thriving economy. It's a death cult. It has used the state as a war zone to kill and maim your people, and you have the moral right to annihilate that war zone in the name of self-defense. No one can stop Israel from defending herself, and if anti-Semitic member states of the European Union fail to condemn Hamas's call for the destruction of Israel and its goal of establishing a global caliphate, which would see the persecution and death of apostates, Jews and Christians alike, remember such countries are political ballasts in this issue. It is regrettable that people simply engage in affected ignorance regarding the covenants and charters of both the PLO and the PA and Hamas. Hamas, they must know, calls for the destruction of Israel and the eradication of Israel as part of the global Islamic imperialist state. The goal is the restoration of the caliphate, an institution of global Islamic domination. Quoting the Quran, Article 7 of Hamas's charter. Article 7 is taken from the Hadith Bukhari, Volume 4, Book 52, number 177, and quotes the Prophet Muhammad. It declares genocide of world Jewry a necessity. Hamas's founding document is, as Caroline Glick points out, the presentation of an outline for a totalitarian movement dedicated to the obliteration of Israel in the name of Islam. It explicitly calls for the rejection of peace negotiations with Israel and commands for a jihad. Our readers must know that Hamas terrorist operatives have used terror tunnels to infiltrate where they have repeatedly launched, to infiltrate Israel, where they have repeatedly launched terror attacks against civilians. The Palestinian Authority's charter calls for the explicit removal of Jewry from the region and makes it unequivocally clear that Jewish and Palestinian cohabitation are morally, existentially, and logically impossible. Anti-Semitism is rooted in the political charters of governing Palestinian institutions. They are core constitutive features of their moral, political, and social identities. Not one Palestinian governing body has produced anything but terrorist institutions. It is not accidental that Palestinians have only produced terrorist organizations as governing bodies to challenge Israeli sovereignty. We're going to take a short break, and in the conclusion, I'll finish my letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is Jason Hill, and you're listening to The Jason Hill Show. Welcome back to the show. This is Jason Hill, and you're listening to The Jason Hill Show. There is not any democratic or individual rights respecting institution that could produce charters that call for the obliteration of Israel and Jewry. Palestinian nationalism, as opposed to the civic nationalism of liberal democracies such as Israel's, replete with respect for individual rights, religious reciprocity, and freedom of association, are anathema to such principles. Since Palestinians overwhelmingly vote for terrorist governing bodies that have as their explicit goal the annihilation of Jewry and Israel, no distinction should be made between the terrorist organizations and their deputized stand-ins and surrogates. Any attempt, therefore, to make peace with individuals who institute such terrorist governing bodies is not only a breach in national security, but an egregious moral compromise. More than anyone else, you know that one does not negotiate the terms of one's existence with people whose moral and political identities are predicated on the death of Jews. Jewish presence and its proximity to their existence are existentially intolerable to them. They hate you for one and one reason only. And it is the same reason Jews have been hated for millennia, because you are Jews. Prime Minister, I know that against the backdrop of all this, that you know in your heart and mind that a two-state solution can never be the ultimate resolution to this ongoing conflict. For what will an independent state call for, and what will it be granted? Or for what will it be granted? A full-scale military and naval fleet of its own? Given the charter of the PLO and the PA, and given their record of terrorism, and against the backdrop of the First and Second Intifadas, Israel can never allow an enemy faction replete with a full arsenal of weaponry that will undoubtedly be unleashed against a country within its own state. You said it best, Prime Minister. If the Arabs put down their weapons today, there would be no more violence. If the Jews put down their weapons today, there would be no more Israel. Because of their unpardonable crimes against Israel, the Palestinian leaders and all those who support them have evicted themselves from the realm of rights. Regarding the issue of Palestinians who vote for terrorist organizations, I reiterate that Israel may properly regard them as national security threats. Those who renounce terrorism, the PA and Hamas, and terror as means for fighting for the so-called liberation of Palestinian land, there can be no such thing as legitimate Palestinian territory in a geographic region legally seized in a defensive war instigated by a foreign aggressor. Those who have never been a member of a terrorist organization or pledged any allegiance to any sworn enemy of the State of Israel, and who, after a thoroughly thorough secure vetting process, display patriotism towards Israel, may be considered for citizenship. You and your citizens have celebrated monumentous achievements. The independence of the victorious 1967 War, where you defeated an amalgamation of foreign aggressors, united in their goals to destroy your state. You've also celebrated the Declaration of Independence of Israel in 1948, which is really the refounding of your lost ancestral home, a homeland stolen from you several times, beginning in 587 BC, when Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar captured Israel and destroyed the first temple created by your sovereign king, Solomon, king of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, and your people were exiled to Babylon. Throughout millennia, your exceptional people have prevailed as a diasporic ethical heroes. Wherever you lived, you have always made stupendous contributions to other cultures. You arduously repair the world as you suffuse it with an original assemblage of who and what you are, an ethical people stamped with the imprimatur of God's blessings. As I have said in one of my books, not the last one, but the one before the last, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, a paean hymn to American exceptionism, Jewish civilization is a superior and exceptionist one as well. In no part of the world, quote, were Jews ever granted an affirmative action visa to work, to excel, and to make awe-inspiring contributions to world culture in all fields of knowledge. Your ancestral home, Israel, is the only nation blessed in the Bible by God. Several times it has been stolen from you. Today it threatens to be destroyed by nefarious and politically primitive regimes that surround you, and by enemies inside your sovereign state who abide by charters and covenants that provide a roadmap for your country's destruction. Close quote. Today you face a not insurmountable battle in the impending battles, enemies that lie ahead. As you reflect on your destiny, do know that God would not have appointed you to this historic role only to snatch it away in such an indecorous manner. I believe it is your will and soldierly resolve that are being tested. Your vision for a more magnificent Israel will be honed and refined, and ultimately, without doubt, forged in the crucibles of the moral vision you have steadfastly made as part of your vocational calling. You are the only leader alive in Israel who truly understands the nihilistic and irreversible evil of the jihad campaign. You alone see jihad as the single greatest threat to the West, and you alone realize its grave danger to our shared civilization. In crepuscular moments, when you are blessed with increased discernment and the burdens of your civilization weigh upon your shoulders, remember that your first king, King David, faced a minimum of 3 civil wars during his first year alone. You are not only the legatee of a great tradition, but the heir to an historical legacy of which you are its treasured custodian. When you go to the United Nations, you alone seem to know the malevolent threat that Iran poses to your unmatched civilization. You alone seem to discern the evil conspiracies between the political leaders of that country and Hamas. You will prevail, Prime Minister, because I believe you have suffered enough on earth through tragic loss of family and professional setbacks and hardships to convince your country that Israel is not any longer interested in land for peace. This move has not gained your country any international respect. Quite the opposite. It has diminished the stature of Israel by making her seem overly conciliatory before the ugly and despicable face of jihadism. Israel, I know, you realize, will not sell out her moral reputation by sharing any semblance of sovereignty via a suicidal two-state solution with terroristic thugs who have seduced much of the Western nation-states into viewing them as hapless victims. Any reader of contemporary Israel knows that the average Arab fares better economically and existentially under Israeli governance than he or she does under the corrupt, useless, and inept PA and under the nihilistic cult of death regime that is Hamas. You will prevail because you're a great patriot. You're a loyal stalwart, not just for the cause of political Israel, but because you know that Jews were the creators of historical time and the first nation to enter into the historical process. You sense the precarious delicacy of ensuring survival against the jihadists that are all around you, around all of us in the West. You were given a mandate by the people and by God himself to raise your state up to a higher register of earthly evolution. The Jewish state is an international treasure trove because it is not just a repository of good, of human excellence and greatness, as well as the benefactor of the first great moral system, but also the Jewish people as an aspirational people. The world is never complete for them. Sometimes God seems absent from the world, as if he had divorced it, but Jews take up the mantle of moral leadership. Knowing that God's return is imminent, they become fiduciaries and trustees of the world at large. Rather than ask God to reveal himself to them, they find God through reparative, restorative, and emancipatory work on this beautiful earth. They prevail upon the world, hence the Jewish people are a universal people. They're a post-human people. By this I mean they give us a model for what an evolved humanity could look like in a world that is seemingly devoted to shrinking our humanity and therefore the best within ourselves. Having discovered the first monotheistic religion and the sole God who commands the universe, Jews have placed the moral sensibilities of Western man on a linear trajectory and a theological path that has led him to discover the foundations of his moral nature. The teleological destiny for Jews was, among other things, the promise and deliverance of a nation. It was one that was destroyed and then refounded on secular principles, but undergirded by the prevailing doctrine of ethical Zionism, a philosophy that ensures that the Jewish people will always have a home of their own and that they will never be displaced as an exalted civilization and relegated to a despicable backyard and ghetto in anyone else's homeland. Your legacy has yet to be completed, Prime Minister. You are the custodian of an ethical and beleaguered state, the most beleaguered state on this earth. You hold the great future of a greater Israel in your open palms that face towards heaven. You hold a magnificent beacon of light, worthy of emulation. Do not let your heroic fire go out. Do not let specimens of the lowest common denominator in your country appropriate the moral vocabulary of victimization and use it against you. Fight with intransigent pride of your moral dignity, of your ethical state. Assert your convictions with implacable certainty, knowing that they are for the good of Israel and Western civilization. And Prime Minister, know this, again, in the name of the best within you. Yours is the glory. The Jason Hill Show is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.